Legal limitation. Freedom of speech. Group 3. Group members. Harikesh Chandran, leader. Divya Sivakumar, Eunice Wong Xiaoqing, Sonia Balamurali, Sean Kao Jinki. Introduction. Legal limitation of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is the right to express ideas and opinions freely, which supports democracy, accountability, and creativity. However, this right is not absolute. To protect national security, public order, and social harmony, especially in a multiracial country like Malaysia, the government imposes certain legal limitations. Internationally, this right is supported by UDHR Article 19, and in Malaysia, it is provided under Article 10(1)(a) of the Federal Constitution, which also allows Parliament to set restrictions. One of the laws that limits speech in Malaysia is the Sedition Act 1948. This law aimed to balance individual freedom with the nation's peace and unity. Sedition Act 1948. Sedition Act 1948. Historical background. Introduced by British colonial government, 1948. Purpose. To suppress political dissent, prevent rebellion, and maintain harmony in a multiracial society. Key provisions. Criminalizes speech that causes hatred, discontent, or disaffection against the government, monarchy, race, or religion. No need to prove intent. Speech can be seditious based on interpretation or effect, even if the speaker meant no harm. Controversy. Used frequently post-independence, 1957, to limit freedom of expression. Often targets opposition leaders, journalists, students, and ordinary citizens. Criticized as vague, overly broad, and open to abuse. Legal framework. Sedition Act 1948. Malaysia. Origin. Introduced by the British in 1948. Aimed to suppress nationalist and communist movements during colonial rule. After independence, continued to be used after Malaysia gained independence in 1957. Amended several times to fit changing political needs. Purpose of the act. To ban any act, speech, or publication with a seditious tendency. What is a seditious tendency? Section 3(1). Creating hatred or contempt against the government or rulers, promoting hostility between different races or groups, questioning sensitive parts of the Federal Constitution, Article 152, national language, Article 153, special rights of Malays, Article 181, sovereignty of the rulers. Intent is not a defense, Section 3(3). A person can be guilty even if they didn't mean to cause harm. Punishment, Section 4(1). Publishing, printing, or distributing seditious material is a crime. Penalty up to 5 years in prison. Banning of publications, Section 10. The government can ban materials it considers seditious, often used to restrict media and silence critics. Legal framework. Vague terminology. Terms like hatred, disaffection, and contempt are not clearly defined. Allows broad interpretation by authorities and courts. Covers sensitive topics. Criminalizes speech about the 3 Rs: race, religion, and royalty. Enforcement history. Used against politicians, activists, academics, and citizens for critical speech. Federal Constitution, Article 10(2)(a). Allows laws to restrict freedom of speech for national security and public order. Restrictions must be reasonable and not excessive. Conflict with international standards, seen as violating Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of opinion and expression. Malaysia is not a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. 2015 amendments, expanded to include offenses via electronic media. Restricted bail for those charged under the Act. Made the law stricter, despite earlier promises to repeal it. Rational legal authority. Part 1. Definition. One of 3 types of legitimate authority. Others, traditional and charismatic. Based on formal laws and organized procedures, e.g. constitutions, courts, parliaments. Legitimacy. Power is seen as valid because it follows legal rules, not personal power or traditions. Authority comes from legal systems, not individuals. In Malaysia, exists through the Federal Constitution and laws made by Parliament. Example, Sedition Act 1948 operates under this system. Sedition Act's legal standing. A colonial-era law that remains valid after independence. Considered legitimate because it was properly enacted and continues to be enforced by legal institutions. Key idea. Under rational legal authority, laws are binding because they are made through official legal processes, not due to royal power or customs. Part 2. Legal, but controversial. The act is valid under the law, but its vague wording, e.g., seditious tendency, can be misused. Freedom of speech, risk, may limit freedom of speech, which is protected under Article 10(1)(a) of the Constitution. No need to prove intent. Section 3(3) says intent doesn't matter. This makes it easier to charge people unfairly. Government's defense says the act helps keep peace, unity, and racial harmony. These are legal reasons to limit speech under Article 10(2). Still legally valid, passed by Parliament, and used by courts, so it's legal under the system. Conclusion. Shows how law can maintain order, but also shows why laws must protect rights and allow free speech in a democracy. Key case law. The actual application of the Sedition Act 1948 in Malaysia has also been shaped by judicial readings in many court rulings. The cases indicate the balance the courts have maintained in Malaysia between the competing interests of freedom of speech and the interest of the state to ensure the maintenance of public peace, harmony, and the special constitutional protections for the monarchy, race, and religion. The following 4 cases are particularly vital for an understanding of the scope and boundaries of the Sedition Act under Malaysian law. pp. Weakersake and others. 1971 2 MLJ 108. Facts of the case.
In 1969, a few days after the general election, a political rally was held in Penang. One of the speakers was Uiki Sayak, a leader from the opposition party, the Democratic Action Party, DAP. Along with a few others, he gave a strong speech in front of a crowd. In his speech, Uy talked about how the Chinese community felt they were being treated unfairly. He also criticized the government and questioned the special rights given to the Malay community under the Constitution. Uy and his friends believed they were just sharing their political views. They felt they were using their freedom of speech, which is protected by Article 10 of the Constitution. But soon after, the police arrested them. They were charged under the Sedition Act 1948, a law that says you can't say anything that might cause hatred or bad feelings between different races. In court, the government said the speeches could make people angry and divide the country, even if that wasn't their intention. The law says it doesn't matter why you said something. It only matters what effect it might have. Uy and the others said they didn't mean to cause trouble. They were just talking about politics. No fights broke out after their rally. But the judge disagreed. The judge said, even peaceful words can be sedition if they can cause problems. In the end, Uy Saik and the others were found guilty. This case showed that in Malaysia, freedom of speech is limited, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like race and religion. Even political speeches can lead to legal trouble if they're seen as a threat to peace and unity.
Issue of the case. Whether the statements made by Uy Saik and the co-defendants during a political rally, which were critical of government policies and the special rights of Malays under Article 153 of the Federal Constitution, amounted to seditious acts under Section 41B of the Sedition Act 1948, and whether freedom of speech under Article 10(1)(a) could be used as a defense. Decision of the case. The court found the defendants guilty under the Sedition Act 1948. The court rejected the defense of freedom of speech under Article 10(1)(a) and held that the statements made had a tendency to cause ill will and hostility between racial groups, which is prohibited under Section 3(1) of the Act. Ratio decidendi of the case. In this case, the court decided that the speaker's intention or reason for making the speech does not matter under the Sedition Act 1948. What really matters is whether the words used in the speech have a tendency to cause hatred, anger, or bad feelings between different races or communities. Justice H. Tiong explained that even if the person speaking did not mean to create trouble, their words can still be considered seditious if they are likely to make the public feel upset or cause problems between racial groups. This means the law focuses more on how the speech affects people rather than what the speaker meant. The court also made it clear that freedom of speech under Article 10 of the Federal Constitution is not unlimited. If the speech threatens public peace or racial harmony, the government has the power to limit it. So the legal rule from this case is that under the Sedition Act, what the speaker intended is not important. Only the likely effect of the words matters. Binding precedent for future cases. This case set a binding precedent in Malaysian constitutional and criminal law that freedom of speech under Article 10(1)(a) is not absolute and is subject to restrictions under Article 10(2)(a). Under the Sedition Act 1948, intent mens rea is not required. It is sufficient that the speech has a tendency to incite disaffection or ill will. Future courts are bound to follow this principle unless the law is amended or overturned by a higher court. Overall judgment. The court convicted Uy Saik and the other defendants under the Sedition Act 1948. The court held that even though the speeches were made in a political context, their tendency to question the special position of the Malays under Article 153 and promote racial discontent was sufficient to qualify as sedition. The court emphasized the need to protect national security, racial harmony, and social stability, especially in Malaysia's multiracial society. The ruling clearly illustrated the narrow scope of freedom of speech in Malaysia and how sedition laws can override political expression when national unity is seen to be at risk. Application of rational legal authority. In Public Prosecutor v. Uy Saik and others, 1971, 2 MLJ 108, the enforcement of the Sedition Act illustrates the exercise of rational legal authority by the Malaysian government. This authority is grounded in laws formally enacted by Parliament, following established legal procedures and constitutional principles. The legitimacy of this power is based on the rule of law, rather than arbitrary decisions or traditional authority. By prosecuting the accused under the Sedition Act, the state acts within a lawful framework aimed at maintaining public order and safeguarding national security. This case highlights how rational legal authority justifies limitations on freedoms, such as speech, when these freedoms are perceived to threaten social harmony or incite disorder, reflecting the state's role in balancing individual rights with collective interests. Lim Guan Eng, Uy, pp. 1988, 3 MLJ 14, facts of the case.
In 1997, Lim Guan Eng, a Malaysian politician, spoke out about a serious case. A 15-year-old girl said she was raped by a powerful government leader, but instead of punishing the man, the girl was sent to a detention center. Lim thought this was very unfair. He gave speeches and printed leaflets asking, why is the victim being punished, but not the man who hurt her? Because of this, the government charged Lim under two laws: the Sedition Act 1948, for saying things they claim could cause people to hate the government, and the Printing Presses and Publications Act 1984, for publishing what they called false news. In 1998, Lim was found guilty and sent to prison for 18 months. Many people believed this was not fair. They said Lim was punished just for telling the truth and standing up for a young girl who needed help. This case became a strong example of how speaking out in Malaysia could lead to jail, even when you're trying to do the right thing.
Issue of the case. The main issue in this case was whether Lim Guan Eng's speeches and public statements amounted to sedition under Section 4(11)(b) of the Sedition Act 1948. The court had to determine if his words, which criticized government policies and officials, had the tendency to incite ill will, disaffection, or hostility among Malaysia's diverse ethnic communities, and if such speech was protected under the constitutional right to freedom of speech under Article 10(1)(a) of the Federal Constitution. Decision of the case. The court found Lim Guan Eng guilty of sedition. It held that his statements had the tendency to cause dissatisfaction against the government and to incite ill will between the various ethnic groups in Malaysia. The court ruled that the freedom of speech guaranteed by Article 10(1)(a) is subject to reasonable restrictions, especially when the speech threatens public order and national harmony. Lim Guan Eng was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. Ratio decidendi of the case. The court reasoned that political speech, while important in a democracy, is not absolute and can be restricted if it has a real tendency to incite hostility or public disorder. The key test is whether the words used are likely to create ill will or disaffection against the government or among different racial groups, rather than focusing solely on the speaker's intent. The court emphasized that the Sedition Act protects national unity and social harmony by limiting speech that risks inflaming racial tensions. Stare decisis of the case. The case followed and reinforced the precedents set in Public Prosecutor v. Uy Saik and others, 1971, 2 MLJ 108, where it was held that the intention of the speaker is irrelevant under the Sedition Act. What matters is the tendency of the words to cause disaffection or hostility. Lim Guanang reaffirmed that the courts prioritize the effect of speech on public order over the freedom of expression, especially in matters of race and politics. This case remains a key reference for subsequent sedition cases in Malaysia. Overall judgment, the court upheld the validity and enforcement of the Sedition Act in limiting speech that poses a threat to racial harmony and political stability. While acknowledging the importance of freedom of speech, the court emphasized that this freedom is not absolute and must be balanced against the need to maintain public order. The judgment underscored the government's power to restrict speech in a multi-ethnic society to prevent communal disharmony, thereby limiting political dissent that could disrupt social peace. Application of rational legal authority. The Sedition Act, under which Lim Guanang was prosecuted, exemplifies the exercise of rational legal authority in Malaysia. This means the government's power is derived from laws formally enacted by Parliament, according to legal procedures, as embodied in the federal constitution and statutes. The legitimacy of this authority rests on the rule of law, not on personal or traditional power. By enforcing the Sedition Act, the Malaysian state acts within a legal framework designed to preserve social order and national unity, demonstrating how rational legal authority governs the limitation of rights, like freedom of speech, to protect collective interests. PPV Azmi bin Sharom, 2015 8 CLJ 921. Facts of the case.
In a quiet lecture hall at the University of Malaya, Professor Azmi Sharam spoke to a room full of students, calm, thoughtful, passionate about the law. He wasn't a politician or an activist shouting in the streets. He was a teacher. One day in 2014, a journalist asked for his opinion about a political crisis that had happened 5 years earlier. The 2009 Perak constitutional crisis, when the state government suddenly changed without an election. Azmi answered honestly, like any academic would. He said, "What happened was legally wrong. It shouldn't be repeated." A simple quote, a professional opinion, that's all it was. But that one sentence changed everything. Soon after, Azmi was called in by the authorities. He was shocked to hear the charge. Sedition, for giving an academic opinion about the law. He wasn't accused of violence or hatred. Just words, a thought, a legal analysis. He stood before the judge, not angry, but calm and firm. "I am a law professor. If I can't speak about the law, who can?" But the court saw it differently. They said the Sedition Act, created in 1948 by British colonial rulers, was still valid, and that his words, though peaceful, could cause public unrest. In the end, Azmi wasn't jailed, but his trial left a mark, not just on him, but on every classroom in the country. The federal court upheld that the Sedition Act is constitutional. Azmi's charges were eventually dropped, but the case sparked national debate about academic freedom and freedom of speech.
Issue of the case. Whether the Sedition Act 1948 is constitutional and enforceable in post-independence Malaysia, particularly in light of Article 10(1)A of the Federal Constitution, which guarantees freedom of speech, and Article 162, which deals with the continuation of pre-Merdeka laws. Did charging Dr. Azmi Sharam under the Sedition Act 1948 violate his constitutional right to free speech, and can a colonial-era law still be valid in modern Malaysia? Decision of the case. The decision of the federal court was to uphold the constitutionality and enforceability of the Sedition Act 1948. The court ruled that the act remains valid under Article 162 of the Federal Constitution, which allows pre-independence laws to continue in force post-Merdeka, provided they are modified as necessary to be consistent with the Constitution. Furthermore, the court held that the limitations imposed by the Sedition Act on freedom of speech were legitimate under Article 10(2)A, which permits Parliament to impose restrictions in the interest of public order and national security. Ratio decidendi of the case. The ratio decidendi of the case lies in the legal principle that pre-Merdeka laws like the Sedition Act can remain enforceable if they are brought into harmony with the Constitution, and that freedom of speech under Article 10(1)A is not absolute. Parliament is allowed to limit this freedom through laws such as the Sedition Act, provided such limitations serve a valid constitutional purpose, such as maintaining public order. The court emphasized that the validity of the law does not rest on when it was enacted, but whether it conforms to the constitutional limits placed on free speech. Stare decisis of the case. The case also affirmed the doctrine of stare decisis, as the court did not overrule prior decisions like PPV Karpal Singh and PPV Ong Kian Cheong, which had interpreted seditious tendency broadly. By following these precedents, the court reinforced the view that the effect of the speech, not the intent of the speaker, is what determines whether it is seditious. This approach has been consistently applied in previous sedition cases, and Azmi Sharam's case continued this judicial trend. Overall judgment. The overall judgment of the court sent a strong message about the balance between freedom of expression and national interest. While the Constitution provides for freedom of speech, this freedom is subject to legal boundaries, especially when the speech is perceived to threaten public order or the monarchy. The judgment has been both supported and criticized. Supporters argue it maintains stability, while critics claim it suppresses academic freedom and public discourse. Application of rational legal authority. In terms of the application of rational legal authority, the court grounded its judgment in constitutional interpretation, referring to Articles 10 and 162, and applying principles of legal continuity and parliamentary sovereignty. The court used a formalistic approach, emphasizing legal structure and hierarchy, rather than the moral or philosophical implications of punishing academic speech. It relied on existing legal precedents, statutory interpretation, and constitutional provisions, thereby illustrating a rational legal basis for upholding colonial-era legislation within a modern constitutional framework. Conclusion. Sedition Act 1948. In conclusion, the Sedition Act 1948 continues to be a highly debated law in Malaysia because of its broad and restrictive nature. While the government defends it as necessary to protect national security, racial harmony, and the monarchy, many people argue that it limits freedom of speech and democracy. One major issue is the vague and wide definition of seditious tendency, which gives too much power to the police and prosecutors, risking abuse. Another problem is that the act does not require intent, so someone can be punished even if they had no intention to cause harm. The punishments, such as jail or fines, are also harsh and often used to silence peaceful critics, journalists, or academics. The selective use of the act against political opponents creates fear and discourages open discussion. Its use on social media also raises concerns about censorship and loss of privacy. Although civil society groups like SOARAM and the Malaysian Bar have called for the act to be repealed or reformed, and even though past leaders promised changes, reforms have not happened. The biggest challenges to reform are Malaysia's sensitive racial and religious mix, political unwillingness to lose a powerful law, and a lack of public awareness about free speech rights. Unless these challenges are addressed, the Sedition Act will continue to threaten open and democratic discussions in Malaysia. Thank you.